Okay, so we're back. Part 3 of the reading. I think what I'm going to do today is set a timer so that I cut off at 30 minutes. Weird thing that happened was, even though I didn't do that in the last 2 videos, and I just stopped when I felt like stopping, I ended up stopping within 1 minute of the same duration each time, which kind of blows me away. It was like 40 minutes, and then the other one was like 40 minutes and 50 seconds. So anyway, let's start this and jump over to the article. I've got some coffee here. If you hear me sipping, that's what's going on. All right, so I finished with this paragraph yesterday. Let me reread it real quick. Okay. So this was a bit which was like, come on guys, other people have been doing this better for thousands of years. We can do this. We don't have to accept this crappy solution that we currently take for granted. All right, moving on. This document. Wow. Have you ever written something and called it this document? Because I don't know that I have. I mean, except for things that are supposed to be like a proposal or like a reference document or like whatever the term for it is in companies when they create like documentation for different processes. This document, but this is like, I mean, it's a newsletter. It is funny, I noticed that it's Sasha's quote newsletter. So what's that supposed to mean? Is it supposed to be cheeky? I don't know. But yeah. But it's interesting to write something that you would put in a newsletter or a blog and call it a document. It definitely shapes how we think of what we're reading and how he thinks of what he's writing, right? And this whole sentence is very much like, because yesterday I was wondering, when is he going to tell his story? You know, because he's made some proclamations about the state of things, much more grand stuff about societal level issues. And I wonder when he's going to talk about himself. And so, I mean, how far are we down? That's a fair amount of writing that I've gone through. It's a small portion of the total, but it's a fair amount. With this sentence, it's like he's finally saying what the project of this particular piece of writing is. It's like everything else was almost like a preamble, in a sense. This document, right? And also, this calling it a document fits in very well with the overall, I don't know, metaphor or paradigm that he's using in this article, which is to say that, look, we should all work on this. We can all work together to make something better than the current crappy paradigm of mental health, right? He says a better world of mental health might start with this kind of thing, right? So basically, now that I'm getting further on, I'm seeing that he kind of set himself up by saying this, right? He's like, I think this is how we can do it better, and then here's me doing my part by making this document. I might seem nitpicky about words, but it is really impactful, right? If he were to say this book, it would mean something totally different. Or if he were to say this white paper, it would mean totally different. Or if he wrote this story, or if he wrote this article, or this essay, right? Each one of them carries a meaning and an implication and associations for the people reading. So document is like documentation. It's official. It's something that you refer to. It's something that guides efforts, like right there. It's not like a piece of entertainment. It's not just something to provoke your thought. It's something that's supposed to be almost like a piece of technology in and of itself. A piece of writing that functions as a piece of tech. Operationally. That might not have made sense, but whatever. So this document is a further attempt. Don't take it as a strict recommendation. I don't know. Specifically, I don't think. It's nice that he says that. I personally don't use them, and I'm not really interested in using them, and I have a lot of concerns about how they're often used, but not enough to tell people not to. This is such an interesting word too. Exemplar. So, like, again, it's not something that I don't know that I've ever heard him talk, but I don't think that he probably says this word out loud. When I read it, the first thing that came to mind is the Knights Templar. I think that's how you pronounce that. It just makes it sound really big and grand, and the Knights Templar, it's like associated with kings and queens. And this is interesting. A demonstration of what's possible, even in a totally unsystematic, lurching search for inner peace. So this is basically a description of his own journey, the story that he's going to tell us. And he's saying that even though he didn't really know what he was doing, he didn't have a strategy, he didn't do it like in a very meticulous way, he did get a lot of wonderful results. And that's a pretty powerful thing to say, especially in terms of making a promise to the reader. It's like, look, I barely knew what I was doing, and I got great results. Imagine, he's not saying this, but imagine that you did do this systematically. If you did do this with a lot more intention than I've done it, you could get so much better results. That's kind of the implication. Oh, this is interesting. I thought he was gonna say, "Well, I have one piece of advice, but it's not gonna make sense until after you read it. So I'm not gonna tell you until the end," which would have been such a tease, but a great way potentially to get somebody to read more. That's like in really, I mean, scammy, just since it's usually thought of that way, online marketing, copywriting, and sales videos and things like that. You'll often hear or read the copy. It will be like, "I'll tell you more about that in a minute, but first, blah 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 blah." And they're always like introducing these new ideas that seem super relevant that you need to know, but then they'll be like, "I'll tell you later." So you have to stick around to listen. I thought he was going to do something like that, but I guess not. Find ways to bring more and more of yourself into loving awareness. It's a really good description. I haven't done any metta, right? Like Tashin's metta, loving kindness meditations, but I am a huge internal family systems nerd, and to me this sounds very much like a way of describing what it would mean to be in self with a capital S. Really, even just being really embodied and grounded, so to speak, where you're not really in your head, you're not thinking about things. Right, because so challenged, it means being like objected to, and that's something you do with your mind. That's something that happens intellectually, right, in thought. And conceptualized, again, it's about ideas, concepts, something you do in your thoughts. So spacious, these moments of spacious, calm throw, tranquil connection. Is much more somatic than mental or intellectual. I like this word too, repulse, especially the parts that most repulse you. That's a really hard thing, you know. I wonder what he'll say later, but yeah, like that's extremely difficult. The parts of you that you find repulsive. There's a woman who I haven't studied directly, but I've heard secondhand about her thinking. She's a trauma specialist. Her name's Kathy Kane, and she has a quote that goes something like, when you're working through trauma, if you want to, resolve trauma, like you have to be willing to smell the dead rat. So it's like you really have to be willing to look closely at and deal with these things that you probably find disgusting. Like in a very literal, visceral way, there are these things, these memories, these experiences that you might not even consciously remember, but that are, kind of embedded in your nervous system and in your memory. That you literally find repulsive, that you have a visceral, somatic, physical response to. Like, you have to be willing to look at that, I love that sentence. Gently but intently. Really glad that he says this. If it is destabilizing, back off. Yeah, because you can totally mess yourself up if you go too deep. Even this is part of the reason that I'm not particularly interested in psychedelics myself, is that I know that I can, in full sobriety, I can bring up or dive deep enough that I can get almost overwhelmed. Not even almost, I can get fully overwhelmed by the things that I can pull into consciousness in a totally sober state. So, and then it takes work and conscious effort to process that stuff. And so I don't want to blast the doors open any more than that, because that can be entirely counterproductive. Here we go. This is more than anything that story. I like that. Okay, so he introduces the story in a really cool way, right? So he's like kind of proposing to us, as to us readers, for us to try something, right? He introduces this piece of advice, and he's like, "Hey, okay, I think this is something you should try." And then he explains that, right? It's all about, it's you. He's talking about us, not in theory about people could do this. He's not talking about himself. He's talking specifically about us. This is directed at us. But then he transitions it into his story. So after describing what it looks like to bring loving awareness to yourself and let yourself be surprised and love the thing that surprises you, this is the story of doing that. Yeah, I really like how he did that. Okay. Wow. This article is so much longer than I was expecting it to be. And the fact that he's only really getting to the story here is surprising, interesting. I like it, you know? So to get there. To get where? Am I being thick right now? To get where? Is that not a relevant question? This is more than anything that story. It is long. To get there, to get to the story, like, are you talking about transitioning to telling the story, or providing context for the story, or I don't know. I guess we'll have to see. See, this makes you curious, right? He's really good at this, inciting curiosity so that we keep going. It's like those really obnoxious ads that you see online, right? It's like one weird trick. But this is like that same thing, but done in a nice way, not an obnoxious way. Oh, what is the weird thing? I want to know. I owe you the truth. I mean, that's quite a thing to say as well. Why do you owe us the truth? I owe you the truth. I mean, that seems like, for me, since this is the first time that I'm reading Sasha, and really the first time that I'm taking in any of his work, I'm totally new to him in that sense. And so I feel like this I owe you doesn't apply to me, right? But like, this doesn't make sense to say in a relationship between him and somebody who's never interacted with him or read him before. But to people with whom he has a relationship, right, like subscribers of this newsletter, to say I owe you does make more sense, because there is a relationship there. There's a level of trust that's been established. Because you don't owe anyone anything. Like, if I'm just a stranger, you don't owe me. There's no obligation on your part to, like, spill your whole truth to me. But obviously that's the weird thing about being like a writer or somebody creating anything where you share of yourself, that strangers can find that, right? And they can learn about you at a depth that most strangers, if they just actually met you, would never find out so quickly. And this is sort of where parasocial relationships kind of spring into being, where people feel like they know you because they've kind of have this huge window into who you are, even though you don't actually have a relationship. You might never have talked to each other. So that's kind of just an interesting question to me, actually. It's like, at what point, what does a relationship between a writer and the audience have to be for the writer to have an obligation to the audience? It's just an open question. I don't think there's not any one answer to that. All right, moving on. Before we get into it, let me tell you more. Interesting. All right, so bullet points. How far does this go? All right. I saw that he has a link to Existential Kink, so I was right. He is the one that talks about that book. So, some more about what Deep Okayness is like and what it is not like. What it is like. greater affection. So he's not saying it, but this immediately makes me think of the, what is it? Ventral? Oh man, I'm gonna mix it up. Ventral or dorsal vagal. Anyway, the parasympathetic nervous system in the sort of rest and digest and social engagement state of the nervous system. You just have this greater affection. Stephen Porges talks about this in his work on the vagus nerve. And then similarly in IFS, Dick Schwartz and others, when they describe qualities of capital S self, affection, it's not one of them, it's not the same term, but it's a general feeling. It's like just a warmth, compassion. Yeah, it's all C words. Compassion for other people. Right, so you could say compassion and then less worrying about what they think of you, so compassion and confidence in oneself as well. This one's big. I've been experiencing this big time in the past couple months. This one's big. I have heard Doug Tatterin, I think that's how you say his last name, bio-emotive. Wait, what's the whole bio-emotive? What? Framework. Yeah, he talks about how he actually thinks doing things like his Nadera process and processing these stuck emotions it's actually an important first step instead of going to meditation first, because a lot of the time all of that trauma, basically, that stuck emotions, those unprocessed emotions, the inner conflict, prevents you from dropping into the meditative state that you could get into if that stuff weren't blocking you. And so to try to just bang your head against the wall and meditate doesn't really get you anywhere. And it's better to start with emotional processing. Everything more pleasant. That's funny. All these are like pretty long, and then everything more pleasant. Everything's just nicer. All right, what it is not like. It's not mania. I'm reminded of earlier when he writes #blessed. There's like a sort of like extreme highs and extreme lows, right? Some people might be experiencing an extreme high and be like, oh my God, I finally achieved happiness and everything, but actually it's more of like a euphoric state that they are likely to come crashing down from. I really appreciate how Sasha's not describing this or not promising that there's like extreme results from this, you know? It's like things are pretty normal. It's just nicer, you know? Because when you start describing the ideal result as like just being insanely happy, right? As if you're like walking on air, it can be really misleading, and it can lead people to, or it can lead a person to expect something really intense, and then so they go chasing peak experiences, which are not the same thing as just being more stable and healthy. You know, peaks are peaks. They're not plateau. Like, the peak is a sharp point. You go up and you reach the peak, and then you go down. That's how mountains work. You don't usually stay at a peak. You don't summit a mountain and just stay there. You go up, you feel the accomplishment, you check out the view, you know, but then you come down. The point is not to stay up on top the whole time. And I don't know, I mean, I don't do psychedelics, so I don't know how people tend to talk about them, or, you know, what expectations are commonly held about psychedelic experience. But I wonder if it's sometimes or often made to seem like you will experience this peak state, and that it's that state which you should be striving to experience all the time. And I think if it is presented that way, it might be very misleading. Lobotomization. So I guess the point is kind of like, it's not as if he just doesn't have these worries, or he doesn't not have feelings about things, or, right, like less pleasant feelings, I guess. It's not just gone, it's not cut off from him, but it is softer. Yeah, and then being less critical of self doesn't mean I can't figure out what's in my best interest. It doesn't mean that you can't be critical in the not negative sense, but like, you can still think critically and still deliberate. Yeah. I think that is a common assumption about like non-coercion and self-love and stuff, is that it's like, oh, well, if I do that, then I'm just gonna not care about anything, and I'm just gonna want to like lay on the beach all day and not get anything done, and I'm gonna become lazy. And that's not, I haven't experienced that at all. The more I do this work, the more productive I become, but the less pushing I have to do, the less effort it takes, and the more fun I have. It just sort of springs forth out of me, rather than me being like, I have to do this and then try to make myself do it. It's like, it doesn't take energy so much as creates it. And it's like, I'm still obviously concerned with my self-interest, but how you go about being concerned is different as well, or me. Like, you can be concerned with your self-interest in a very anxious way, a fear-driven way, of being like, oh man, if I don't do this shit, my future is going to be really bad. Things are going to be messed up for me, So you're afraid of what will happen if you don't do certain things. But you can also operate in your own self-interest and plan for the future in a way which is based on like excitement and moving towards things you want and not just guarding against things that you don't want to happen. And it might look the same from the outside, right? If you don't hear what's going on in my own head, but it's a big difference. I was just thinking the other night of a meme that probably exists, but I don't think I've seen it. But like, I was imagining like an illustration of like 5 different, Buddhas, just like a person sitting there quietly, right? They all look the same. They all are meditating, right? But we don't know what's going on inside of that person's head, right? One of them could be like, what's for dinner? One could be like, I'm such a piece of shit. One could be like, I'm such a piece of shit. And then another thought popping in being like, no, don't tell yourself that. You should love yourself. And another one could just have no thoughts, right? Or another one could be like, wow, listen to the sound of the birds, or something like that. So meditation is not meditation, is not meditation. If you just try to evaluate meditation from the outside, if you just try to do what looks like meditation, that's not necessarily going to get you anywhere. In the same way that I was explaining in the other video, like therapy is not therapy. It can be done in so many different ways. And sitting by yourself quietly meditating doesn't mean anything in particular. So much can be going on inside the person's head, even if from the outside it looks the same. Self-absorption. I am more concerned than ever before with the well-being of others. He said spacious earlier. Where was that? Spacious. Yeah, I mean, having space for more people. I mean, that's something I can relate to so much. When you are so concerned with, like, what I was just talking about, like, acting in your self-interest, like, out of fear, right? And you're so anxious and preoccupied with that, you don't have a lot of space for much else or anyone else. And I've had periods of time where that is so insanely true that I literally, like, those are my most introverted periods, is when I just don't have space for anybody. And so it's led me to think that, introversion, at least for myself, is not like necessarily this deep quality that I have. It's not necessarily part of my personality. I'm not an introvert. I can also be very extroverted, but I become introverted when I am afraid, because I don't have space for other people. I don't have space to engage in anything but figuring out things for myself, you know? I'm not open to spontaneity. And I don't know that that's necessarily true across the board, you know? That's not the only thing that introversion can look like, but it does, that state of being, for me, certainly does look like introversion. And, but it's not forever, you know. I've felt at certain times like the most introverted person I've ever met. At other times, I've been told that people can't imagine me thinking of me as an introvert, you know. So you're not stuck in one or the other. Passivity. Yeah, I agree with this. I also experienced this. Step 1. Wow, okay, just jumping into steps. Step 1, I made the reject. Oh, I thought you said, but for those who aren't cool, welcome. Comments are very important, aren't they? But for those who aren't cool. But for those who aren't cool, welcome. Shadow work isn't one methodology. Yeah. It's a general mode. Yep. This is what I was saying to a friend just like last week. But, because like I said, I'm an IFS nerd, and I don't tend to use the word shadow, but I definitely do consider IFS to be a version of shadow work. But they don't use, Dick Schwartz doesn't use the word shadow. And something worth pointing out, and he might get to it, is that, you know, the way in which you conceptualize these things, whether you call it a shadow, or you call it a demon, or you call it a part, or you call it your exile, like all of these things shape how you interact with them, right? And one of the very common ways is to consider them demons. And so then when you think about all of the implications for what it means to conceive of it in that way as a demon, it's like, okay, well, it kind of tells you how you should relate to it if you call it a demon. And it's like, most of the time, demons are things that you try to banish and fight, you know, to conquer. You conquer your demons. That's the usual paradigm. I don't necessarily agree with that. I actually take quite a bit of issue with looking at it that way, because I think there are some not very good consequences. But yeah, the way in which you conceive of these things is a big deal, right? A shadow is like something that you cannot grasp, right? A shadow, it doesn't have any material being to it. You can't touch a shadow. If you move, or if the source of the light changes, a shadow will move or disappear, right? It's a very elusive thing. And it's also, it conjures this idea of darkness, the shadows. Things lurk in the shadows. Scary things lurk in the shadows. things that you cannot see. So in a way, it paints those things that you might discover through shadow work as being very scary. You know, obviously not everyone reads it that way, or not everyone's gonna have that much of an implication from that word, but some people might, and it might be really off-putting, right? Compared to, say, doing IFS and just working with your parts. It's like, oh, I have a part. It's like, no big deal. Parts aren't scary. Or if you conceive of them as just younger versions of yourself, right? Like a teen version of yourself or a child version of yourself. It's like, there might be things about me that I don't like or I might find annoying, but it's not terrifying. It's not a demon. Anyway, rambling. Yeah, but it's a mode. Interesting that he says, and thus therapy. It's a mode of approaching the self, and thus therapy. It has 2 precepts. Okay, there are parts of you more IFS-like. But obviously IFS doesn't own the concept of parts. Dick Schwartz formulated this because his clients were already using the language of parts, and he just decided to run with it rather than trying to make them conceive of it in a different way. So parts does not necessarily have to mean we're talking about IFS. Secret pile of loathing. That's great. The desires you resent yourself for having, that's fucking real. Shameful moments of pleasure. Yep. A good chunk of the pain in your life and your maladaptive behavior comes from your conflict with shadow. Yeah. I feel like I wanna spell that out a little more. At least how I think about it. Which is that, because I guess at this point in my life, oftentimes when I think about learning new things or learning a skill or changing habits, one way of approaching it would be to just be like, well, I have to learn the skill. I have to practice the skill. But for me now, and I used to think that way, but for me now, I am much more prone to think of it in terms of like, well, if I had no internal obstacles to doing that or practicing that or learning that, I would be, right? If my desire was unimpeded, then I would be doing it. And I'm not saying that theoretically, because I've experienced that to be true. And I'm experiencing it to be true more and more lately. So rather than spending a ton of effort and time, at the beginning at least, trying to learn that thing or practice that new skill or change that habit, working instead on dealing with the shadow or dealing with that internal obstacle, however you want to conceive of it, and sort of integrating it or processing it or melting it away, in a sense, suddenly you don't have that internal obstacle. And if you still have that desire to do or learn or practice that thing, you now have nothing in the way. And speaking from my own experience, rather than making promises, when you get to a state like that, the things you want to do will just start happening. You don't have to push yourself to do them. It can oftentimes take you by surprise that you suddenly are just like doing the things you've always wanted to do with no effort. So I'm gonna wrap up here. I don't know how long I've been going, so let's see. It'll be, well, my timer hasn't gone off. Oh, I guess it did.